It is a wonderful honor to welcome Benjamin Kerstein on this podcast. He is a writer based in Israel, and we are discussing his wonderful article on the website Quillette titled Sex and Smash Steel, where he discussed this great novel, Crash by J.G. Ballard. I'm holding in my hand the UK edition. The cover art actually was done by Stanley Donwood, the guy who did all of those Radiohead cover album. So, Ben, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I, like you, share my love for this disturbing but fascinating novel. But I should like to begin by wishing you in advance a happy Passover. So, if you may, can you reflect, celebrating this high Jewish holidays during these troubled time for the Jewish population of the world?
Um, well, um, it's a bittersweet sort of experience, but at the same time, the Passover story is one of liberation and resolution for the Jewish people, and it reminds us that we've been through a lot of this stuff before. There's a line in the Passover Haggadah that says "B'chol do v'do," which means essentially in every generation. In other words, this stuff keeps happening and we've survived every time. And, if we survived slavery in Egypt, we'll probably make it through this time. But certainly it's not easy.
Who is it that said that was it the entirety of Jewish history can be summarized in three sentences, right? They tried to kill us. We survived and
Yes,
eat.
they
Yeah.
failed. Let's eat. Yes. There is something to that, to most holidays. But Passover is a very inspiring holiday in some ways, and it's obviously, in times of trouble, it reminds us of survival, and not just survival, but also the great fruitfulness and creativity that the Jews have achieved despite everything, often under very difficult circumstances. So
Wonderful. Well, I hope you have a warm and friendly celebration in the coming few days.
thank you. Thank you.
Of course, we're here to talk about Crash. So let's dive into it. Tell me about
Yes.
the first time you read the book.
I actually, interestingly enough, tried to read Crash when I was still a teenager because I had seen the David Cronenberg film and was deeply, deeply disturbed by it,
Mhm.
and felt that perhaps if I read the book, I might have more of an insight into why it was so disturbing. Um, and I got about a quarter of the way through the book and just couldn't keep going with it. It was, in some ways, for me, an even darker, or what I call in the article, Gigeresque um, experience, referring to H.R. Giger, who was most famous for designing the monster in Alien. And, very dark, almost gothic, biomechanical, sex and death kind of images. And I had that sense of a kind of oppressiveness from the book and just couldn't deal with it. And I um, put it aside and sort of pushed it out of mind for a very long time until when I was in my early 20s, well, mid 20s really, I sort of came back to Ballard and read it again and was not so much disturbed by it as fascinated. And I just felt it was a novel of such vast and extraordinary ideas, um, that, uh, if you like, how interesting it was, actually overcame the sense of any sort of oppressive or disturbing atmosphere to the book. And I thought that and again, it's a cliche now, this idea of Ballard as being extremely prescient, the prophet, the seer of Shepperton, as he's called. That being said, it's a cliche for a reason. The book is remarkably prescient and it anticipates, the next 60 years of popular culture, really, and of, if you like, societal dysfunction, or, Ballard didn't necessarily consider it dysfunction. He thought that this perhaps would be what he called he called the car crash a fertilizing event. And I just felt that it was so insightful and changed my thinking about a great many things that, I then became, for a little while, semi-obsessed with Ballard's work and read um, a lot of his books, and also I love some of his essays. He was a great nonfiction writer, which people don't necessarily realize. He wrote some wonderful essays on all kinds of subjects, and also interviews with him and so on. And he became very quickly one of my favorite writers.
Wonderful. Yes, like you, I also discovered the novel through the film. Um,
Mm,
like I mentioned before we started recording, I have a friend who was in Canada, and he recommended me to watch everything by David Cronenberg. And
mm.
I've watched several Cronenberg movies before landing on Crash, and I must say that that is my favorite of his. Um,
Oh yes, it's his greatest film by far, I
oh
think.
yes, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I have ambivalent feelings about Cronenberg. I like some of his films very much, and some of them a great deal less. But I think there was such a meeting of the minds between Cronenberg and Ballard. They shared so many of the same obsessions that, in an interesting way, Ballard's novel brought out the best in Cronenberg, I think, and it's by far his most interesting and most I don't know what the expression would be, the most viscerally effective, I think, of all of his pictures. Um, and also, I mean, just the presence of, James Spader and Rosanna Arquette, in what I think are both their greatest roles, without question, and just perfect casting in that sense. Really, it's really an extraordinary film, as Ballard himself acknowledged. Interestingly enough, Ballard loved the movie. Most writers don't love, adaptations of their works. So, yes, I think it's an extraordinary film. I agree.
Yes. How would you compare the book to its film adaptation?
Well, as I wrote in the essay I wrote for Quillette, I think the film is in the end inferior to the book. But I don't say that to put the film down. I just think Cronenberg made a couple of, let's say, a couple of small mistakes and one major mistake, which is that I think jettisoning the theme of celebrity culture, which
Mhm.
he did for very good reason, which is that in the book, Vaughn, who's the sort of, I don't know what you'd call him, anti-hero of the book, this kind of mad scientist who's obsessed with car crashes. His great goal is to kill the Elizabeth Taylor, who was a huge film star at the time the book was written, in a car crash, which obviously in itself is prescient because we have people like Mark David Chapman and Who Killed John Lennon, and celebrity assassins, celebrity stalkers are now, um, in some ways, terrifyingly normal. But at the he Cronenberg felt that it would be socially irresponsible to put that into the film because he was scared that, he was saying that, you could hire a movie, I don't know, Julia Roberts or something, like a big movie star of the time, and sort of put her there in place of, um, Elizabeth Taylor. But he felt that would encourage celebrity stalkers. And he also felt that no major movie star would consent to being portrayed as the target of an assassin. So he jettisoned that theme, and with it, I think, the theme of celebrity culture. And I think that, unfortunately, is a major flaw in the film because it's so important in the book, and in some ways is the most prescient theme in the book. Because celebrity culture now rules the world. I mean, especially with social media, stuff like that. I mean, in a way, you can think of Donald Trump as being the triumph of celebrity culture. You know what I mean? I mean, like a major celebrity actually became president, and they were talking about Oprah Winfrey running against him.
Mhm.
So this has conquered the world. So I think it's unfortunate that Cronenberg jettisoned that theme, although it's understandable why he did so. And the second problem is, the casting of Elias Koteas as Vaughn. I think it simply doesn't work. He's not an intellectual enough actor, and in the book he's portrayed as this kind of rail thin, almost Jordan Peterson type character, and I think that that miscasting is problematic. But there's stuff in the film that is in every way the equal of the book, and I think particularly the sex scene in the car wash in some ways is even more effective than the passage in the book, which is an extraordinary piece of writing. But I think in some ways the way that Cronenberg shot that in terms of the, I always think of the sort of leather curtain snaking across the chassis of the car and stuff like that. It works terribly well in cinema, and I think there's marvelous stuff in the film. Although I do think, in the end, the book is superior if you like as an analysis of the themes that it addresses.
Okay. Now, for those who are not too familiar with the film nor the book that it is based on, so I'll just give a quick plot summary, so to speak. The main character is, I think, named after the author himself, James
Yes.
Ballard. He's known.
Hmm.
He's played by obviously James Spader in the movie. He got
Yes.
into a car crash, but before that crash, he lived a rather dull life with his wife. I think it's Catherine, and they
Hmm.
sort of on this
Hmm.
sort of polyamorous open relationship thing. He
Yes.
got into a car crash, and he met several characters. Among them is this Dr. Robert Vaughn, and all of them, I think he lured his wife into this ring too of people who derive erotic pleasures from car crashes, either watching them or participating in them, or in one case, recreating a few of them. So that's where Elizabeth Taylor comes in because
Hmm.
Robert Vaughn, this the main character, this scientist type, he wishes to crash his car into Elizabeth Taylor, the
Yes.
the movie star. So with that, I'd like to quote from a passage from the book. So this is after Ballard had his initial car crash. Okay, quote, the crash was the only real experience I had been through for years. For the first time, I was in physical confrontation with my own body, an inexhaustible encyclopedia of pains and discharges, with the hostile gaze of other people, and with the fact of the dead man. After being bombarded endlessly by road safety propaganda, it was almost a relief to find myself in an actual accident.
Mm.
Now,
Yes.
yes.
That's pure Ballard.
Mhm.
That passage. Yes, and that really to me underlines the great theme of the book, which is and of in some ways all of Ballard's work, which is that trauma and catastrophe and dystopia. And this to me is his great transgression. All of that may not be a bad thing in the end. It may make us more alive. It may enhance our experience of life. It may give us new possibilities of creativity and eroticism. And I think in that same passage, it sort of goes on, and Ballard talks about, for example, finding inanimate objects erotic and sexual. Like metal shelves and stuff like that. There's a kind of sexualization of everything, a totally polymorphous sort of sexuality. And I think that is the great theme of Ballard, and it is his great transgression. And I think it's also in many ways true. I think that people um, who go through trauma, and certainly, being based in Israel, I've been through it too, um, are some can be broken by it. But often they rebuild themselves and in some ways become better for it, And so I think that and Ballard himself went through a terrible trauma as a child, which was being interned in a prisoner of war camp during World War II, a Japanese prisoner of war camp. And he always spoke of that experience as ultimately being a positive one. It gave him a deeper understanding of life than, say, someone who grew up in, let's say, an American suburb, during the 1950s or something like that. So yeah, I think in many ways that sums up the great theme of Ballard's work. That passage you just quoted, and it again, I think that it's I think it's in some ways one of the more accurate things that Ballard said, and you can see that really in my personal favorite of all his books is The Kindness of Women, which is the sequel to his autobiographical novel Empire of the Sun. And in The Kindness of Women, which is also it's sort of a fictionalized autobiography of the rest of his life, you very, very much see it, that sense of redemption through trauma, or at least redemption from trauma throughout his work, which is why I think ultimately he's a hopeful writer. He's an optimistic writer, as sort of disturbing as much of his work may be.
Mhm. Now, ever since having watched the movie and now, reading the book, I come to think of all the ways in which at least Western culture has eroticized the automobile as a vehicle, right? You see in
Mm.
car commercials, they're often the car is often featured with a sexy looking woman, and men who drive cars are seen as having more sex appeal than men who do not. And I think Crash seemed to take that notion of the eroticization of cars and take it into a whole new disturbing level.
Yes, and I think also that is one of his great prescient insights, because today all technology is eroticized. I mean, that's the whole point of, if you like, late capitalism and advertising. The purpose of advertising is to eroticize everything, to make everything attractive, to make everything desirable, to get people to buy it. And I'm not, by the way, saying that as a criticism. It's simply a fact. I'm not a, I'm not saying that as a sort of left-wing attack or a sort of right-wing lament. It simply is. And I think that, particularly with the internet, um, and I think that this was something Ballard did not explicitly anticipate, but in some way it's the consummation of the trends that he was observing. The internet has allowed um, every fetish conceivable to mankind to be indulged and enhanced and perhaps purged in a cathartic way. Who knows? But everything through the internet, has been, if you like, eroticized. And you know, I have there's that line, I can't remember what it is, like Rule 32 or something. If it exists, there's porn of it.
Good
And
point.
I combine that with my, I think that there's another rule, which is if it exists, someone has a fetish for it. So you combine the two of those, and I mean, there must be websites for people who are, turned on by, I don't know, toenails or something like that, I think, that was a real insight of Ballard's. And again, he's implying this is not necessarily bad. This could create a more sensual, a more erotic, a more enjoyable experience of life, you know, and it's in us, these sort of perversities, and we may need to get them out. He was a Freudian, he was a huge admirer of Freud. And I think that he felt we may need to get this out. We may need to, express these things, and we may be healthier if we do so.
Yes. I think one good definition of what pornography consists of, and I think both Crash the book and Crash the film comments on, you know, uh, in some ways, a porn adult culture that unfortunately most of
Mm,
us, or many of us, suffer through. A good definition, I think, is that something that is enjoyed intensely by some, but for those who are not, they find completely revolting. Of course,
mm.
I think you and
Like
I,
Crash itself.
yes,
you know
yes, I think you and I think would be reasonably offended or revolted at people who find car crashes sexually arousing somehow. Um, but there are people who find certain fetishes or commodities or acts completely pleasure inducing, while the rest of us just either do not get it or find it in incredibly abhorrent. Now,
Yes.
now from what you know of Ballard and the novel, how and why does pornography have this effect on people?
I think that and I have to say I'm probably a little bit more ambivalent about pornography than you are. I'm not convinced it's an entirely bad thing.
Mhm.
And I don't think Ballard was convinced it was entirely a bad thing. Obviously, there's, you know, as an industry, it can be incredibly exploitative and brutal to the people in it. But I think as a phenomenon, it may not be entirely bad. But I think the pornographication of everything is very, very simple. It's like junk food. You're just maximizing access to something that is extremely pleasurable. And when that happens, a lot of people are gonna go with it. I mean, pornography is in some ways the ultimate form of giving the people what they want. So in that sense, it's almost the ultimate form of advertising. you know, it's people are going to watch other people want to watch other people have sex, and identify with them and gain their own pleasure through that. That an industry in a hyper capitalist world, the fact that a huge industry has developed around delivering that to people, doesn't shock me at all. I mean, there's a reason why people get addicted to drugs. It's because it feels really, really good. It's just also really, really bad for you in many ways. Um, but I think that again is one of Ballard's great insights, that pornography was going to become ubiquitous. Um, and in a way, he was just extrapolating out certain trends, because at the time when Crash was written, it was kind of the gold, what they call it, today, the golden age of porn, where pornography almost became mainstream with films like Deep Throat, which I actually think is a disgusting film. I mean, it's unwatchable. And a couple of other very big hits that were hardcore pornography. And I think that Ballard was just extrapolating that out. He said, in some way, we're going to find a way to access this stuff full time. And I think it's interesting that, pornography in every technological development, pornography has always been at the forefront. It was the first industry to grab onto the VCR, and the videotape. It was the first to grab onto DVDs. It was the first to, embrace the internet, completely. And it's been on the cutting edge of all that stuff. So I think Ballard really saw that was happening, but he also notes the negative side of it, which is the deadening effect that it has. And even though they're, when they're watching car crashes, you know, he notes that they're starting to find this boring. That these fetishists are watching these car crashes, and eventually Vaughn says, all car crashes are basically the same. You know, and he engages in kind of ritualistic sex with prostitutes and things like that. And that's absolutely what's happening today. I mean, if you watch pornography, it's highly ritualistic. It's the same acts performed in the same order every single time. And I think that the people do grow dead into it and seek more and more extreme forms of pornography. And that's, if you like, the dark side of it. But again, Ballard is impish enough to say, well, maybe that's not so bad. You know what I mean? I don't know if I agree with him on that, but that's Ballard in a nutshell. Um, so yeah, I mean, again, it's hugely prescient, and I think that although he didn't directly anticipate the internet, in other words, as a technology, I think that everything that has happened as a result of the internet, he basically predicted. You know.
Um, so I'd like to zero in on another one of the other characters in the novel, Dr. Helen Remington. So the
Mm.
crash that I mentioned that injured Ballard um, was also injured Helen and also killed her husband. I think
Mm.
it was in a subsequent chapter that Helen, when she looked at the wreckage of the car that her and her husband were in, she said that, well, I cannot imagine anyone would want to get in a vehicle ever again. But after that, she, like Ballard, enthusiastically participates in this like car crashing and sexual arousal inducing events. So
Mm.
how would you examine her, I guess, motivations behind her actions?
I actually, that is, I think, sort of difficult, because I think Helen, unfortunately, is one of the characters that's a little underdrawn in the book. And actually, in some ways, the film fleshes her out a bit more,
Yeah.
maybe just because Holly Hunter is so marvelous in the picture. But I think that what he's dealing with Helen Remington is in some ways an even more extreme form of what happens with James Ballard, the character, which is that she reacts to trauma through hypersexuality,
Mhm.
and she tries to counter death through um, the erotic, which again is very, very Freudian. I mean, Freud had this whole idea about the contention between sort of the sex drive and the death drive, that we have a drive towards senescence, but we also have a drive towards creation and reproduction, and they're in contention with each other and sometimes merge, you know. And I think that Helen, in her, and there's a passage in the book that talks about how she embarks on this kind of odyssey of promiscuous sexuality and has sex with numerous men in cars and stuff like this. And I think it's a form, in a way, of defiance, that she's defying this trauma by eroticizing it. And by she's defying death through sex, in a way. And again, in that sense, she's a hopeful character. I think Ballard is saying this is how people deal with this stuff. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's how Ballard dealt with his traumas, was not necessarily through rampant promiscuity, but through his sexuality. And it's how also Gabrielle, the disabled
Yeah.
character, deals with her trauma, is through sexualizing her disabilities. And so I think it's the idea that sexuality can be a redemptive force in our lives, rather than something to I don't know what the word would be, to be sort of frightened or ashamed of. Although I don't think that Ballard's making a moral point on that thing. He's just sort of examining the phenomenon. Um, and I think it would be interesting if, say, a female writer um, took the character of Helen and wrote her own novel based on her, as sort of like an offshoot of Crash, to get sort of the female view on the themes that Ballard is dealing with. So that would be my take on it. And again, I mean, Holly Hunter really brings that
Yeah.
character to life in the film. I mean,
Mhm.
she's wonderful in it.
Yes. So I'm glad you mentioned the Gabrielle character. She's played by Rosanna
Mm,
Arquette in the film. And
yes.
this is one scene in the film, and I think that's the one that seared into my brain the most. And obviously, it's in the novel too. So Ballard, James Spader, and Gabrielle Rosanna Arquette, it's in the car, and they are engaging in obviously intercourse. And um, Ballard saw that one of her wounds is shaped like the human female anatomy, the vagina, and he
Mm,
basically penetrates his penis, his male member, into that.
yeah.
And in some ways, I think that scene alone kind of what representative of what I think pornography is. It is something that is exploitative on both the male part and the female part. Gabrielle
Mm,
is exploiting Ballard's arousal of her, and he
mm,
of her, and it is something that both parties can consent to, but we as people who look outside see as something that's profoundly disturbing and immoral, and something that went
mm.
profoundly wrong somehow. So tell me what you think about that scene.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually, from what I've heard, I can't remember where I read it, but apparently the rumor was that that was the scene that convinced Ted Turner, who was supposed to be the American distributor of the film, to refuse to release it. And Turner was a kind of, fairly conservative fellow, and I think that, that apparently that scene was what just completely, he just found it so revolting that he was like, morally, I can't justify releasing this picture. um and although it was eventually released in the United States in a sort of art house run. But I think that that scene, and actually in the book it's even more sort of intense, in that it talks about Ballard sort of ejaculating into her wounds, repeatedly. You know what I mean? But I actually don't see that scene as exploitative. I see it as, in some ways, almost sort of moving, because I think that it's, again, that theme of like achieving pleasure through um the things that have traumatized and wounded you. And I think that in the film, for example, it's very clear that Gabrielle is very much enjoying, what Ballard's doing. And I think that although it's a grotesque scene and it is revolting on a visceral level, I think that in a way it's, you know, and you also have to mention that Gabrielle is encased in braces. She's kind of, she's got all these sort of metal and latex things basically holding her body together. So she's almost like a quasi cyborg. And I think that scene is about, in many ways, sort of this, on the one hand, this idea of merger of sex and technology, which Ballard talks about a lot, but also I think it's in a way a kind of, in a machine world, a kind of non-human world, that this act of sort of perverse sexuality is a kind of assertion of humanity and an assertion of empathy between Ballard and Gabrielle. And so in that sense, I think it's actually rather touching. And I think it's interesting that the film today has a cult following, as the book does. And apparently, a large section of that cult following are disabled people
Hmm.
who see Gabrielle as an inspiring figure, because they feel that society in general basically sees disabled people as not having a sexuality. You know, they don't, they're not desirable and they don't desire, you know. And Gabrielle is seen as the antithesis of that. So a lot of disabled people see her as an empowering character, which I find very interesting, and probably something Ballard didn't anticipate. Let's say that.
Yes, of course. Um, so you mentioned the topic of how hypersexuality can be a a redemptive force or against a force against trauma. And in some ways, I think about how the Disney child stars, um, I
Mm.
think, Miley Cyrus and Bella Thorne are the names I have come up in mind, where in their adult lives they've fashioned themselves to be these like super sexy and desirable pop stars and such. And you've mentioned that you don't find this to be in any way, I guess, condemnable, or rather you find it to be redemptive. So tell me more about it.
Um, First of all, that's a terrific insight. I think that's really true, and I wouldn't have thought of that. But I do think that in that case, um, the problem with that as a redemptive thing is that I don't get the sense that it's self-generated.
Mhm,
I get the sense that this is just pure exploitation,
mhm,
that these kids reach puberty and they have to be sold in a different way. And the way to sell them is, in a Ballardian sense, to appeal to the darkest sexual instincts of people, which is essentially the male desire for very young girls, which is there, I think, in every man. Most of us understand that it's not a good thing, in the sense of, it's nothing we should act on, and we don't act on it. But I think I think, for example, the Britney Spears phenomenon.
yeah,
Um, I find the whole phenomenon of Britney Spears very disturbing, because from the minute she emerged on the scene, the way that she was sold to the public was blatantly pedophilic. I mean, you had a 13-year-old girl dancing around with her midriff exposed in a schoolgirl's uniform, you know, and clearly with no idea what she's doing, and being essentially exploited by the adults who are presenting her that way to make enormous amounts of money. And I don't think Ballard would have viewed that as redemptive. I think I think Ballard, because it didn't, obviously couldn't have come from her. A, because she was too young, to have been aware of it. And B, because it was obviously intended purely as a money-making project. Um, I doubt that Ballard would have seen that as a positive thing. And although, who knows? He was a provocative guy. He might have decided to play the devil's advocate on that point, and say, well, actually, at least as a fantasy, it's not that bad. But I think, for me personally, to see what was done to a lot of these pop stars, I think it's pretty horrible.
oh yeah,
Um, and I think a few of them have spoken out of that about that, haven't they? A few of them have sort of gone public with saying they were too sexualized when they were child stars and things like that, and that
mhm,
it really affected them. How they deal with that, as adults, I don't really know. But in that case, an enhanced sexuality may be redemptive as a way to deal with it. I don't know.
Mhm.
But I think with Ballard, it's very, very important to remember that all of the characters involved are very, very aware of what they're doing. You know, none of them are sort of acting without any consciousness of what they're about. And it's very hard for me to say that Britney Spears or Christina Aguilera or even some of the male, you know, like Justin Timberlake and stuff. I doubt very much that this was anything coming from them.
Mhm.
You know, I think it was Madison Avenue basically
Mhm.
doing it.
Yeah,
So
I've realized also as you were speaking that a lot of celebrity scandals involve cars too. I think
mm,
Britney during one of those phases where she shaved her head, she was like smashing a car. Lindsay Lohan got into a few like DUIs. I think Hugh
mhm.
Grant was caught having a
With
prostitutes
a
around
prostitute, yes.
around his member while he was in a car.
Yeah,
I think Mel Gibson and I think something that I think hits too close to home to you is anti-Semitism.
his
And that was
anti-Semitic rant,
also
yes.
around and in a car.
Hmm.
So in some ways, Ballard's this connection between automobiles and celebrities was even more prescient than I thought. He was drawing
Yes, and I
attention.
mean,
Yeah.
the death of Princess Diana, for
Yes.
example,
Yeah.
has probably outstripped the deaths of James Dean and Jane Mansfield
Mhm.
and all the rest of it as the single most famous car crash death in history. You know,
Mhm.
and that was years after Crash was published. And of course, it led to this incredible outpouring of public grief in Great Britain, where clearly the fact of her death in that car set off this unbelievable psychological phenomenon, you know, in Great Britain. And I think Ballard, you know, I doubt he can't possibly have been surprised by that. You know
Mhm.
what I mean? Because it's right there in Crash, you know. And he actually, there's a passage in the book where he talks about I can't remember what it is exactly, but it's like he says something like the death of Elizabeth Taylor in the car crash would be the moment of unification between her and her audience, you know. And yeah, the moment when Diana passes into legend and becomes one with the British public was the moment of impact of that car in a Paris subway, you know. And I don't want to be too morbid, but if you look at, there's a handful of pictures of Diana in the car after the crash, and you know, this very beautiful woman in the middle of this crash car. It's the ultimate Ballardian image. It's not something that I like to look at, but I mean, it could be right out of the book, you know. And yes, today it continues today, and I think that that aspect of celebrity culture, the fascination with the breakdown of these celebrities, Britney Spears's mental decline, Lindsay Lohan's obvious psychological problems, all the rest of this. We like to watch celebrities dismantling themselves or being dismantled. Um, and so even if there isn't actually a car involved, it's still a kind of crash. It's some kind of disastrous impact that the people have. And I actually thought of that with the recent death of Matthew Perry, where he went through his whole sort of narrative of like, I did all these horrible things, but then I was redeemed and now I'm sober. And then, a couple of months later, he dies of a drug overdose. And it's like, this is almost, I think people would have been disappointed if he hadn't died of an overdose.
Mhm.
And it's like what they said about Elvis when he died, great career move. But this is what unites the audience and the celebrity is this moment of death. And I think Ballard was on that long before anybody else was on it. It's at the very center of Crash. And as I said, it's unfortunate that it's not at the center of the film in some ways. But yeah, it's that is one of the biggest themes of the book. And I don't know if it's the most prescient aspect of it, but it's one of the most prescient aspects of it, I think. And
Yes.
I also find it very sad. Just for me personally, I find the breakdown of these people really tragic to watch in some ways, which I don't think was something Ballard explored. But uh, but there is an atmosphere in the book of the human in a way resisting the machine. That there's an assertion of humanity in the book, and I think Ballard actually said, I think it was him, where he said that the final scene in the film, which is not in the book, which is that Ballard and his wife staged their own car crash, and Catherine is injured, and and the last shot is of Ballard and Catherine having sex next to Catherine's crashed car.
Yeah.
And Ballard said that he saw this as a very moving assertion of humanity in an inhuman age.
Mhm.
And I think that he would have found the travails of Britney Spears and, Lindsay Lohan and so on to be deeply, deeply tragic and deeply, deeply moving. He never wrote that. That's purely my speculation. It's my
Mhm.
personal feeling about it. But I think he would have seen that as, if you like, the dark side of what he was talking about, of technology crushing these people, and he would have viewed a genuine sexuality as a resistance against that. So,
Mhm. Yes, I'm reminded that in 2 months, I think we are going to come up to the 15th anniversary of the death of Michael Jackson. I think
mm,
June 25th, 2009 was his passing. And I
mm,
remember that it was like the first time that a death of a celebrity impacted me personally. Um,
mm,
and even by that time, I'd only listened to like a few songs of his. I think it was like Thriller and Bad. Um, but yeah, so the same way that we as consumers of celebrity culture, we watch with curiosity these breakdowns and downfalls of celebrities. You know, obviously Michael Jackson had a turbulent 2000s with all the child abuse
mm,
allegations that I think we are still discussing today. And
yeah,
he was like poised for comeback around that year, 2009, and when, of course, his life was cut short by an overdose. We also revered him, and when Michael Jackson passed away, we felt like I think a family member has died. Um, and of course, Ballard was uh, addressed this celebrity culture in with much profundity. I wonder, in your view, why do we seem to treat our celebrities the same way as we treat our troubled family member?
well, that's a very interesting question. I think it's because of what I think it was Marshall McLuhan proposed, the idea of a global village.
Mhm.
But essentially, because of the media, we're no longer really urbanized. We kind of live in this virtual village, which Ballard, in a sense, also anticipated. He wrote a short story, I think, called The Enormous Room, which is about a man who just sits in his room, orders food delivered, and just has banks of television screens, where he's watching movies over and over and over again. The whole world is sort of virtually piped in, to this one room. But I think that, yeah, because of television, particularly, and now the internet, we feel a deeply intimate connection to these celebrities. And we feel like they're kind of, in some ways, the person who lives next door, or our eccentric uncle, you know. Um, and we develop profound emotional bonds with them, or at least their image. Um, I'm being a little retro here, but for example, the artist that I probably most admire is Bob Dylan, and I wrote an essay about him in Quillette. Um, and I think that, and I'm thinking, he's in his 80s now, and I'm thinking, well, what's going to happen when Bob Dylan dies? And I realized that I'm going to feel like I lost, an uncle, or a cousin, or an older mentor or something like that. Why do I feel that way? I think it's because we know so much about these people, in a sense, and we know their work so well. I mean, I'm sure that there's Michael Jackson fans who could sing almost every song he ever did, you know all the lyrics, know all the dance moves that he did, and I think that we develop this intense, intense emotional intimacy with them. And again, it's that idea of the unification between the celebrity and their audience that Ballard was talking about. In the case of Michael Jackson, though, it's interesting because I feel like, in a way, he's not so much anticipated by Crash as he is by the previous novel that Ballard wrote, The Atrocity Exhibition, where he writes a short story, for example, called The Facelift of Princess Margaret, you know, and the role of plastic surgery in some ways in molding the celebrity image quite literally, under the knife. And obviously Michael Jackson, um, I don't want to use the word notorious necessarily, but he was so fat. People were so fascinated with his use of plastic surgery and the way he changed his entire face, his entire self in a way, physically, if you want to look at it positively, turning himself into a work of art. If you want to look at it negatively, mutilating himself. But that's a point of view. But I think that Michael Jackson, in that sense, he's anticipated more by the atrocity exhibition than by Crash, I think. Even in some ways in his death, you coma Marilyn Monroe. He goes into a kind of permanent coma. But again, I also find Michael Jackson in some ways a very tragic figure because he was scooped up by the Motown machine at the age of, how old was he?
I think it was
8
like
when he
six when he
became a
first
star.
become when he joined. Was it Jackson 5? I think it was 6.
Wow. Yeah, so he's scooped up as a child, turned into a major star, you know, and lives his entire life as a celebrity. And clearly um it led to some extraordinary work to which people are to this day intensely attached, but it also, I think, had awful consequences for him personally. And so I find him in some ways a very tragic figure, you know, and in some ways a prototype of that, child pop star kind of phenomenon. And we feel that too. I think people feel that connection with Michael Jackson in a way because they do know he was tragic. And maybe they see the tragedies in their own life in him. You know, maybe they see the anguish that they perceive in him and in some of his music, you know, as being their own. The fact that he had no childhood and always wanted one. I'm sure there's millions of people in the world who feel that way, you know.
Of course, yes. So you mentioned Ballard and his wife. So their relationship before Ballard's crash was kind of stale and boring. And I wonder,
Mm,
throughout all their participation in the car crash shenanigans, mostly organized by Vaughn,
mm.
did they find what they were looking for at the end?
Yes,
Mhm.
yes. And I think that's one of the most hopeful aspects of the book is that Ballard and his wife, and it's there in the film too, very much so. And Deborah Kara Unger, who plays Catherine in the film, is astounding. I think she's wonderful in the movie, and heartbreakingly beautiful. I mean, she's just stunning, And but I think that they do find a way back to each other through that traumatic experience, and they understand each other with a level of intimacy at the end of the book and the end of the film that was definitely not present at the point when it begins. And I think that in a bizarre way, that's actually kind of a very conservative message. It's saying stay with your wife in the end. You have there's the possibility within this marriage of exploring each other's inner selves, without losing yourself in the process. So stick together, hang in there. You know what I mean? Like don't break apart the way so many marriages do today. It reminds me in a way of Eyes Wide Shut, the
Mhm. Yeah.
Stanley Kubrick film, which is my favorite of all of Stanley Kubrick's movies. I know
Mhm.
that's perhaps a minority view, but I think it's an incredible film. But at the end of that movie, it's very, very clear that despite this deeply painful and anguished odyssey, that you've seen over the course of this whole movie, that the couple, the Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman play, have found their way back to each other, and they've not just found their way back to each other, but they've reached a new level of intimacy that has reawakened their desire for each other, and they now know each other more deeply than they did before. And I think that is the case also in Crash. And I think that, there's this extraordinary line near the end where after Vaughn dies, Ballard says to Catherine, I have to drive again before it all goes, you know, and Catherine understands that. I think it's certainly implied that she understands that, and that they're together now. That he says that to her because he knows that she'll understand, you know, and that to me is one of the great hopeful aspects of the book that, Ballard doesn't sort of bash you over the head with it, but I think it's definitely, definitely there.
Mhm.
Um, And I think it's interesting that, Ballard is in an open marriage with his wife. They're polyamorous.
Mhm.
That was not normal, in the early 1970s. That was definitely not something that people did just sort of as a thing that couples do, let's say. Whereas in the book, right from the beginning, it's taken as really not worthy of much comment that they're in a polyamorous relationship. And that I think is very prescient again, because, and I hate to keep using the word, but at the today, I think there's polyamory is not entirely normalized, but it's almost normalized. Wouldn't you say? I mean, I think most couples aren't polyamorous, but those that are not really ostracized or looked down upon the way they were in the past. You know, and I think that um, Ballard and his wife, right from the beginning, are more like a married couple today than like a married couple of the 1970s,
Mhm.
which I think is very interesting.
Yeah. Um, I think by now they call it like ethical non-monogamy now, which is very boring. I think swinging still has like a good ring to it,
Mm,
but yeah.
yeah,
Um,
which I actually think is I mean, I have a hard enough time dealing with one person. I don't know how you deal with two or three. You know what I mean? It's an incomprehensible lifestyle to me in some ways. But if it works for certain people, then you know, I'm not one to gainsay it. But yeah, ethical non-monogamy. I think Ballard would have found that phrase very amusing. You
yes.
know, because I don't think he thought there was anything really ethical about sex.
Mhm.
In the sense that I think he viewed sex the way the Marquis de Sade viewed sex. It's beyond good and evil.
Mhm.
You know, the most we can do, the only way that we can really control it is to understand it. We have to try to understand it, but we can't understand it on a moral level. We can only understand it on the level of our individual psyche. Um, we can understand what drives it. We can understand what focuses it grabs onto. We can understand our fetishes. We can understand our obsessions, perhaps, but we cannot understand sexuality in a moral sense because sexuality doesn't recognize morality. It's a natural force born of billions of years of evolution. It doesn't care what human beings think about it, if you know
Mhm.
what I mean. So I think he would have found the idea of ethical non-monogamy very, very amusing. Let's put it that way. Although I don't necessarily think he would have objected to it. I think
Mhm.
he would have been. I think he would have
Yes.
been interested in it. I think
Mhm.
I think he was someone who was interested in the world. In all of its bizarreness. And I don't think Ballard really ultimately was a moralist per se. I think he had his own judgments of things. But I think that he ultimately he was just interested. There is that scientific sense to Crash. There's that detachment in a way that you really see in the atrocity exhibition, where he's just kind of cataloging. He's just kind of, measuring, doing the math. You know what I mean? Like, writing it out on the board or putting together, a PowerPoint presentation about all this. And I think in some ways that's the most appealing part of his work is that kind of he's like a kind of psychoanalyst or a scientist sort of notating everything down, which
Mhm.
is really what you see in the atrocity exhibition. But it's there in Crash too, I think,
Yes.
and definitely there in the film. I think there's a real sense of the detached observer in the film. Cronenberg has a very icy sort of take on things, and there's it's a very interesting way of doing it. It's almost like in some points watching a wildlife documentary. It's like you expect David Attenborough to come up and be like these extraordinary creatures. But it's for me personally, as someone who's it's a pretentious term, but is fairly intellectual. It's in some ways the most appealing aspect of his work.
Mhm. Yes. Like it or not, Sartre was as much a child of the Enlightenment as Voltaire and Diderot and Rousseau.
Oh yes, oh yes, absolutely.
Mhm.
I mean, he's Sod to me is in some ways the most courageous thinker of the Enlightenment because he's willing to confront the Enlightenment with its own implications. He's willing to say, okay, man is the measure of all things. Well, here's man. It's not always pretty, is it? And I really think his work, especially his extreme work, which I freely admit I've barely read because it's so disgusting I can't get through it. Um, he is not exploring his own perversities so much as he is presenting scenarios of the extreme in order to challenge the prevailing ideology of his day, which was the Enlightenment. And I think Ballard, in some ways, was doing the same thing. He was presenting a scenario of the extreme in order to challenge some of the presumptions of his age. I think it was Will Self, the British writer, who's a huge admirer of Ballard, said that he was one of the first science fiction writers
Mhm.
to understand that futuristic cities, dinner in a pill, all the rest, all these, intergalactic space travel, all these wonderful things that science was supposed to give us probably weren't going to happen. And that actually we were going to use technology to service our own obsessions and desires and our pleasure. The pleasure principle was going to rule. Um, and I think that that's a point where, and I think Ballard in Crash is setting up an extreme scenario in order to make that argument and to say, actually, science is going to be a little more interesting than an Isaac Asimov novel. You know, things are going to get weird, and you should be ready for it. I think that's very much what's happening there.
Now, to comment on Desad, I think the reason why his work receives so little appeal, I think even to me, is that it's not cathartic. I think there's this other work that he wrote, Justine. Right?
Mm,
I think it was in some ways, a direct response to Rousseau's novel Julie. So it shows that
yes,
even if
I
you
think
live like
that's
a
the view.
completely
Yeah.
virtuous life, life will find a way to ruin you somehow. So it's not redemptive. And this brings back to me the importance of what Aristotle calls catharsis. So, for
Mm,
example, even if Oedipus, with all of his like incest and uh, patricide and gouging of his own eyeballs out, at least he learned something profound that both he and us as the audience can take away from. Um, even like Holocaust dramas, like I guess Schindler's List, has a hopeful humanist message to it.
mhm.
So the audience are willing to suffer through all the atrocity just to reach this point when they feel a certain hope or something to take away from it. So I wonder, to what extent is Crash the novel cathartic?
I think it's a very cathartic novel because the moment of catharsis, I believe in ancient Greek, was referred to as the peripateia. I think it's the moment when you realize actually that things are different than what you thought, or the opposite even of what you thought. The classic example is in Oedipus Rex, when Oedipus realizes that he's murdered his father and had sex with his mother. That moment of revelation constitutes the cathartic moment of the play. Um, and I think Crash is the great theme of Crash is the peripateia. Ballard realizes he's not the person he thought he was. You know, that the society he lives in is not the society he thought it was, and that is a deeply cathartic moment for him. Sod, I agree, does not have that, and I think that Sod ultimately is not a dramatist. And in that sense, you're right that he's not a satisfying writer. He's an interesting writer, but I agree that he's not satisfying in that sense. Um, and in some ways, he's an evangelist. I mean, he's making a philosophical point. He's not really trying to write a dramatic tale. He's trying to illustrate a ideology, or at least a philosophical point of view. But I think Ballard definitely has that element of catharsis in it. And I think that's what makes, in some ways, his book so compelling, is that idea that, and I think he once actually he stole a line from from an earlier novel, and he said, he sort of paraphrased it. He said, the past is another planet. But I think he viewed the present as another planet as well. I think he said, no, we're living in an extraterrestrial world in the sense that we don't really understand it. But in Crash and his other novels, there is a kind of revelation to be had in them. And I think that moment of enlightenment, like in Oedipus Rex, when Oedipus is horribly enlightened as to what the true story of his life is, which is utterly different from what he thought it was. Definitely there's the term catharsis refers to a kind of expulsion, um, a kind of cleansing, a purification, you know. Um, and I don't want to get too off the subject, but in ancient Greece, I believe it was also used to refer to the exorcism of malign spirits, the chthonic spirits below the earth that are the really threatening ones, death, darkness, sleep, all the rest of it. And that through the cathartic ritual, you could expel them, you could exorcise them. And that's what, Aristotle then posited, that's what tragedy does with our emotions of pity and fear and sorrow and all the rest of it. And I think that definitely Ballard is working in that vein. That's what he's after throughout his catharsis, a Freudian kind of catharsis, but unquestionably, that's the essence of his work.
I think that answer is the catharsis, if I may, we need to end this program. Thank you very much, Benjamin
Mhm.
Kerstein, for joining the show.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for inviting me.